Well, here we go. We have two more sections of Treviso, and then we're going to do a wrap-up activity. But right now, we've discovered Roan is alive. He's this really brilliant guy working out in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian. We don't know his backstory. We don't know how he got there or what led to him being there. We just know he got washed away down the river and was never able to hook up with his brother again. So he's thinking Remacio's dead. Remacio's thinking Roan died as he watched him wash over the falls, and nobody was really left in that village except some of the Shantaya and Remacio and Tepui. So let's continue. Let's see what happens. We've met this interesting woman, Decoli Reed. Roan seems to think there might be something going on there. Well, let's go on and find out what happened. Ding ding, back to the story. Once in the air and seated next to each other, Decoli had a few more questions for Roan. Dr. Treviso, I'm curious about your life before you entered Harvard. Your parents must have realized early on that you were a prodigy. Did it bother them that they were sending a 13-year-old away to college? Dr. Decoli Reed sipped her orange juice and looked directly at Roan. She had noticed earlier that he was a rather handsome man, but now she found herself staring into his unusual and stunning green eyes. The flight to Mexico City was going to take a few hours, and she welcomed the opportunity to learn more about the mysterious Roan Treviso. Like most serious anthropologists, she was familiar with his life during his years at Harvard, but knew nothing of him before that, and very little of him after that, except for what he let Dr. Peabody publish. Roan never talked to anyone about his life before Harvard. It was too painful. Yet, sitting next to Decoli put him strangely at ease. For the first time in a very long time, he just started talking. And he didn't stop. He told her about Minas Nuevas, his brother, the tidal wave, and how the Yanomami fishermen had rescued him. Oh, after the Yanomami nursed him back to health, they had brought him to the workers' camp at the hydroelectric project. And when he learned from the engineers of the magnitude of the destruction in Minas Nuevas, he begged them to take him back there. He made the arduous trip up the Caroni River only to find unimaginable destruction. The dam, miraculously, was still there, though the Rio de Oro flowed over it without obstruction because the reservoir had been filled in from the landslide. He learned that everybody had died. His parents were gone, and he could find no sign of his brother, who must have washed over the dam, or the Shantaya, whom he presumed had all moved on. Somehow, he had been the only one to survive. It was, he told Decoli, either the luckiest or the unluckiest day of his life. He still didn't know which one. He had been brought to the Red Cross in Caracas, the capital city of Venezuela, and eventually sent to an orphanage in New York, as he had no living relatives. After a few months there, he was placed in a foster home with two loving people, Marta and Joseph. Decoli, hardly breathing, knew not to interrupt. Reaching over to Roan, she softly placed her hand on his as he continued his amazing story. Sorry, a little scratchy throat. Ding ding, we're going to pick up, and the next part of this is called the Jablonskis. And Roan seems to be opening up to Decoli for the first time. It seems that he was ever able to do that. Ding ding, back to the story. The Jablonskis. Marta and Joseph Jablonski were good people who lived in the crowded city of New York. The Jablonskis provided Roan with a room, bought him clothes, enrolled him in the local school, and seemed to possess an unlimited amount of love for him and everyone else. They were patient with Roan, but troubled by his withdrawn nature. They knew he had suffered greatly, but were a bit unprepared for his determination to conceal his feelings. He rarely smiled, and he never laughed. The exact circumstances surrounding his time in Minas Nuevas would remain a mystery to them. Roan told them, and anyone else who asked, that he could not remember what had happened, which, of course, was far from the truth. He lived the tragedy over and over again in his mind and in his dreams. Roan liked the Jablonskis, especially Mr. Jablonski, who was a large round man with a full shock of wild white hair that always seemed to be fighting with itself high above his big rosy cheeks. Mr. Jablonski laughed loud, slept loud, farted loud, and only swore on those rare occasions when his beloved Yankees blew a game. Even then, he only swore in Polish, and he treated Mrs. Jablonski like a queen. Mr. and Mrs. Jablonski bowled every Saturday night, and for the longest time tried to get Roan to join them. They thought that it would be good for him. Roan preferred getting lost in books to anything else he could think of doing, so he worked out a deal with them. He would learn to bowl if they would let him stay late at the public library on school nights. It turned out that Roan was a natural bowler and actually enjoyed the activity. After only 6 months, he carried a .225 bowling average out of a possible perfect 300. When an opening came up on Joseph Jablonski's bowling team, Roan filled it. One of the proudest days in Joseph's life was when Roan bowled a perfect game, 300, and helped his team win the league championship. To this day, he tells Roan he should have turned pro. It was at the library, though, that Roan Treviso found a little slice of peace and began to thrive. The library became his fortress. He read stories of the Arabian Nights, Robinson Crusoe, and plenty of works by Mark Twain. He studied science and math and was especially fascinated by other cultures and civilizations, current and past. He did absolutely everything that he could to keep his mind off his lost family, and he soon began to mostly exist in a world of words and ideas far removed from the nightmare at Minas Nuevas. Disturbed by the thoughts that entered his head at night, he often fought them off by reading himself to sleep. Marta Jablonski would then creep in quietly to turn off the light and kiss him softly on the cheek. She knew he was a troubled boy. His thrashing in bed while he slept alarmed her, and she wished with all her heart that there was something she could do to help him. But Roan would not open up. He was running hard and far from Minas Nuevas. School was another haven for Roan, but not in the sense of having friends or a safe place to play. The other kids tended to ignore him, and when it was time for recess, Roan would practice the blending skills that he had learned from the Shantaya so he wouldn't have to participate. Often, he would go completely unnoticed and just stay inside the classroom. This gave him the chance to read or study in peace. School was like the library. He could get lost in another world. He could disappear. And in many ways, the boy that was once Roan had disappeared. His teachers in the 7th grade also tended to overlook him, as he did reasonably well on his tests and never caused any trouble. The following year, almost all of his 8th grade teachers treated him the same way. They didn't notice him because he did just enough work to go unnoticed. You could even say hidden. Carl Schneider, his social studies teacher during the first period of the day, was different. Mr. Schneider took an interest in Roan. Mr. Schneider made a point of trying to involve all of his students in class discussions, but at the end of the day he often realized that he had never heard a word from Roan Treviso. It was as if Roan would vanish during his class. That seemed strange, so he decided to regularly focus on Roan. He observed that Roan held his textbook in such a way as to hide what he was really reading, which almost always happened to be serious pieces of work well above his grade level. He realized that whenever he asked Roan a question, Roan would quietly look up, ask him to repeat the question, and then nail it on the head, even though he clearly had been studying or thinking about something else. He also noticed that Roan never made eye contact with him and that he sat amazingly still all the time. And another odd thing, Mr. Schneider found that if he didn't look directly at him, Roan had an uncanny way of practically fading away. It dawned on Mr. Schneider that Roan was behaving this way on purpose, as part of a deliberate effort to avoid any attention. He began to appreciate how much discipline Roan exercised in remaining so anonymous. Few adults could successfully pull that off. He shared his suspicions with his disbelieving wife, who only rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, good grief." Mr. Snyder also began to analyze Roan's tests. They were brilliant pieces of work, not because of what they showed, but because of what they hid. Roan wrote exactly what was needed to get B's, and often erased passages or ideas from his essays that were too good. On his multiple choice exams, he always scored 85%, the perfect score to go unnoticed. Good enough not to raise any concern, but not so good that he would call attention to himself. As an experiment, Mr. Snyder began to give Roan different tests from the rest of the class, although he casually handed them all out at the same time so as not to alert Roan to his scheme. The tests he gave Roan were much harder than the other tests. He often inserted questions from his old college textbooks. Yet while Roan's tests became harder, his scores remained constant at 85%. Mr. Snyder soon discovered that Roan Treviso was running a scam to keep secret his remarkable knowledge and intelligence. Mr. Snyder was completely fascinated by the boy whose cover he had just blown, and after presenting his wife with all of this evidence, he convinced her to help him. Mr. Snyder's wife had a sister, whose husband had a sister, who was married to a man who taught a class called World Civilizations at Harvard University in Massachusetts. After a couple of phone calls and a lot of fast talking, Mr. Snyder had arranged for a representative of Harvard University to pay a visit to his class. The representative had brought a history test that was given to Harvard University graduate students. Mr. Snyder slipped the test to Roan during the next class exam, betting the rep $10 that Roan would score, you guessed it, 85%. The rep laughed and took the bet. Mr. Snyder was not surprised when Roan scored exactly 85%. The representative, however, was astounded. He himself had only scored 73% when he had taken the same test a few years back. He was immediately on the next train back to Boston, arranging to have someone test the boy's IQ. 2 days later, he was back at Mr. Snyder's class with an expert. Mr. Snyder beckoned Roan from outside the door. Roan, there are some people outside that would like to talk to you. Could you please come here?" All eyes turned to Roan, who was very uncomfortable being the center of attention. He rose from his chair, pushed his glasses back up his nose, and without looking at anyone, made his way to the hallway. There he was greeted by the testing expert from Harvard, who seemed to be more interested in talking than in waiting for a proper introduction. "Hello there, young man. My name is Dr. Hoy, and I'm from Harvard University. I know that may mean nothing to you, but we do know who you are. Your teacher, Mr. Snyder, has indicated to us that you may be a young boy of extraordinary potential, and we are very interested in potential. Some of the greatest civilizations in the world were first built in the minds of young boys with great potential. That's not to say that all of these young boys use their great potential for good, mind you, or that only young men have potential. No. Have you heard of Cleopatra? What were we talking about? Oh, yes, young men. It was often the other way around. Sometimes they used it for quite terrible purposes. Take the young Genghis Khan, often referred to as Genghis Khan, the father of the Mongol nation. He was brutal, no doubt, but he was also a man with a great sense of purpose and a love for all those who lived in felt tents, as he might say. But perhaps this isn't the best illustration of my point. What I mean to say is that, well, and at this point, thankfully, Dr. Hoy went into a temporary lull, providing Mr. Snyder a chance to explain what was happening. Roan, these gentlemen would love to give you a test. If you do well on it, that is to say, if you give it your best shot, there's a good chance that you could go to one of the best schools in the country for free and study anything you want, just about whenever you want. You won't have to pretend, because everyone at Harvard is smart and you won't stand out. Roan took the test. 2 weeks later, he was waving goodbye to the Jablonskys, who were crying their eyes out over something and someone that they never quite understood. Mr. Jablonsky and his teammates sadly had to give up any ideas of bowling league domination with Roan out of the picture. Nevertheless, the team chipped in and bought him a top-of-the-line Dick Weber bowling ball with the initials RT engraved just over the finger holes. This tangible evidence of love touched Roan much more deeply than he was prepared for. He wouldn't forget the Jablonskys. It was after 1 year at Harvard that Roan met Dr. Ralston Peabody, who was there for 3 weeks as a guest lecturer for a series of classes on the Greek civilization. Roan had written a paper that claimed the poisoned arrow that had killed the famous Greek hero, Achilles, during the Trojan War still existed. And from what he had researched on Hellenic culture, he suggested that the arrow could quite possibly be buried with Achilles. If Achilles' coffin were ever discovered, wrote Roan, scientific tests on the arrow would go a long way in determining how much of the Trojan War was simply myth and how much was truth. Dr. Peabody dismissed the idea, but he thought the paper was brilliant. And when he learned that a 14-year-old boy had written the paper, he knew he had a prodigy on his hands. He and Roan Treviso would go on to develop a very warm yet very professional relationship. Dr. Peabody would respect Roan's intense need for privacy and seclusion. And later, when Roan was finished with his PhD, he would go on to perform research for the Smithsonian that was of unprecedented quality. Ding, ding, ding. So, that's a little backstory on Roan. We know he was at the conference center in Caracas, Venezuela, about the same time that Remesio had made the decision to join the Ratones. You have to wonder a little bit if Remesio had made it to the conference center, if they might have found each other, but who knows? You could never tell. Let's go back to the story. Ding, ding. It must have been very hard on you after losing your family at such a young age, stammered Decoli, who was uncharacteristically tongue-tied. I don't believe you can ever completely get over the death of your parents, sighed Roan. But it was even harder facing the fact that I lost my brother. I've always felt that I should have done something that day. I could have stopped it at so many different places along the way. We were identical twins. It was like losing a part of me, and after all these years, I feel it's still missing. I don't know that I've ever really accepted his death, and lately, I can't seem to get my mind off of him. Years later, I returned to Minas Nuevas, but the town was worn out and beaten down. It only offered me shadows of another time. The dam was still there, but all I had known was gone. My history had truly vanished. I guess the hardest part for me was accepting that I was the only one left. I should never live through that. For a long time I felt kind of guilty. He grimaced at the thought. Maybe I still do. Decoli looked glumly into her glass of orange juice. She half wished she hadn't been so curious. As the plane raced through the sky on its way to Mexico, the two sat in shaken silence. Only later did Roan realize that Decoli had left her hand on top of his. Somehow, it made him feel more real, even strong, and he liked that. Next section, Ding Ding called Getting Close. So what's going to happen when they get to Mexico? The Yucatan, where this started so many centuries ago with Kukulkan and Chotec and the Jade Jaguar. Ding Ding, back to the story. The plane actually arrived early, and Roan and Decoli found themselves with some time on their hands as they waited for Jose Guzman to meet them. Tell me, Dr. Reed, are you very familiar with Mexico City? Decoli welcomed the chance to explain. First off, it's Decoli from here on in, and I'm calling you Roan. Roan just smiled. And yes, I'm familiar with Mexico. This will be my 11th trip. I started coming here with my father when I was 7 years old. It's certainly changed somewhat since then. It's now the biggest city in the world. The tone of Decoli's voice was such that Roan sensed he was in for an encyclopedia-like lecture about Mexico City. Something he would have normally chosen to avoid suddenly became very interesting, although he never heard a word. Dr. Reed continued. It's also the oldest and highest city in North America. Before the Spaniards arrived, it was the capital of the Aztec civilization. Wandering Aztecs built their city here after seeing an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. That scene is depicted on the Mexican flag. Currently, the city's growing at a non-stop pace and is faced with huge obstacles. The greatest of those, next to poverty, is perhaps the pollution. Mexico City is in a valley surrounded by mountains. It was an ideal location 500 years ago, but today there's not a great deal of opportunity for the smog from various industries to escape. With millions of people, there's a lot of strain on available resources. The people of Mexico City have their work cut out for them, and that's for sure. Anything else? Ron was impressed, but before he could fashion a response, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Excuse me, senor, might you be Dr. Ron Treviso?" asked a well-dressed Mexican gentleman in perfect English. Why, yes, I am. Senor Guzman, this is Dr. Reed." They all shook hands. "Dr. Treviso, Dr. Reed, I hope I'm not being too presumptuous, but I have taken the liberty of already booking our flight to the city of Mérida in the Yucatan. We'll be leaving directly from here. I know you must be tired, but the Mexican government is interested in immediate action. We believe we have a good lead, so we must pursue it quickly." "We're ready when you are, but please fill us in. Tell us in detail what happened," said Roan, straightening his shoulders and uncharacteristically starting to take charge. "It is a strange thing," answered Senor Guzman. "Try to follow this. 3 days ago, an old man stole the Jet Jaguar of Oaksmouth from our museum. We arrested him, but then he escaped, leaving a talkative yet completely unbelievable little one-eyed man in his place. 2 days ago, we received an anonymous tip telling us where we could find a missing Mayan calendar that had also been recently stolen from the museum. We found the calendar, and who we believe to be the thief, an extremely slippery international criminal known as the Pasha. We also arrested a very unnerved Japanese art collector who told us that he was there to buy the Jet Jaguar. Now, according to his version, a mysterious-looking man, perhaps an American, fought a desperate battle with him and got control of the Jaguar just moments before the police arrived. Then yesterday, the Mérida police received a tip that the Jaguar was nearby in the small village of Muna. Things are moving very fast. The Pasha is apparently wanted in many countries and wants to be extradited to Turkey. He's being held while we decide what to do. Nobody quite knows how all this ties in with the old man who stole the Jaguar in the first place, and we can't be certain whether J. Jaguar is now, but the village of Muna seems to be a very good starting point. Coincidentally, the Jaguar was originally discovered at the ruins near there in 1875, and soon brought to Mexico City by government order, which left some bad feelings with the villagers at that time," interjected DeColey. Senor Guzman ignored the interruption. "Tomorrow we will be driving from Mérida to Muna in order to meet the village elder. He may be able to shed some light on this whole mystery. By the way, the collector from Japan that we arrested is about to be deported. He's just down the terminal at another gate." The group walked together down the terminal, and when they arrived at the appropriate gate, Senor Guzman pointed to a well-dressed but despondent-looking Japanese man. He sat quietly with his hands in his lap, and he looked as if he hadn't shaved for 3 days. He was in handcuffs, and his head hung forlornly. There was a policeman on either side of him. "He got off rather easily, don't you think?" asked Roan. "I mean, after all, just being sent home is like getting a slap on the wrist, isn't it?" "He was not part of the theft itself," explained Senor Guzman. "Legally, he was simply an interested buyer. Besides, he lost $150,000, or so he says, to the man who interrupted his transaction. Authorities in Japan have been notified, and they will deal with him in their own way. I think he got his just desserts, as your people are fond of saying." As boarding was called for the flight to Japan, the 2 policemen escorted the unlucky collector to the airplane entrance. He turned and waited to be uncuffed. At that moment, he looked up and saw Roan, whose glasses were hanging from a chain around his neck. The man from Japan blinked his eyes twice and focused them on Roan's chestnut-colored skin and unique green eyes. Slowly, a look of recognition came over his face. In a rage, he attempted to run at Roan, but was quickly and forcefully restrained by the police. He started screaming in Japanese, one of the many languages Roan knew. "You thief, ghost! You have my money!" The policeman roughly pushed the collector inside the plane, kicking and screaming. Everyone in the terminal looked at Dr. Treviso. "Don't look at me," said Roan, clearly shaken. I've never seen that man before in my life. Senor Guzman put a consoling hand on Roan's shoulder, but looked at him curiously. He is obviously very disturbed. Do not worry about him. What do you know about the alleged man who foiled the transaction between the Pasha and that collector? Asked Roan cautiously. Practically nothing. I'm not at all convinced he exists. And with an index finger, Senor Guzman circled his temple, the universal sign for crazy. The Japanese man said he has a parrot that talks. He laughed. Apparently, from our friend's reaction, the man must look quite a bit like you. The alleged mystery man, said Rowan, who lifted his foot and unconsciously began to rub the tattoo on his ankle. As I had mentioned earlier, we have a plane waiting that will take us to Merida, reminded Senor Guzman. Tomorrow morning we will drive to the village of Muna, about 13 kilometers from the ruins of Uxmal. Please understand that we do not wish to bully the Indians if they do have the artifact, but we would very much like to have the piece put back in the museum where it will be safe. Roan and DeColey looked at each other and shared a smile, amused by the idea of this safe museum that had been so recently robbed. Senor Guzman's face turned red. Well, hopefully it'll be safe now that we have improved security. This all happened under my watch, and I feel personally responsible. Of course, the piece could be out of the country by now. Going to Muna is our best shot, so we'd better get moving. He did not mention that the president of Mexico was holding him personally responsible for the whole fiasco, and that the trip to Muna was really an act of desperation. His job was on the line. DeColey gently elbowed Roan in his ribs to get his attention. He hadn't heard a thing and was lost in thought over the behavior and the words of the Japanese collector. What? Huh? Oh, get moving? Yeah, that would be fine, agreed Roan, as he reached for the obsidian arrowhead in his pocket. Let's go solve a mystery. Ding, ding, ding. And that's where this part ends, and the next part begins, called Pablo's Revenge. So, do a good job on the questions. We're going to wrap this up in the next section. You need to choose 5 of the bold words, define them, say what they mean, and then use it in a sentence. Click on any links, answer the questions, do a good job on this. And tomorrow we'll try to wrap up the story. And it will begin with titled Pablo's Revenge. That's all.